The war in Sudan, arguably the largest war most people haven't heard of. Its impact has been devastating. And while the two main fighting actors, the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces, might be familiar to some of our listeners,
it's a very different, peacemaking process where you have people contributing to the conflict who are then also seen as the peacemakers, whereas before, you didn't have that. The United States and the international community is not going to fix what ails Sudan. Themselves feared that they could be overthrown and that their power structure
into the conflict and targeting some of those oil depots and some of the critical infrastructure.
If on any given day the capital can be hit in a drone attack. Complicated story. There's no easy way to tell it. There's no, guy with a white hat and guy with a black hat. There's no good guy and bad guy.
Hello and welcome to Spotlight Africa, the OSFOR podcast on how information, influence, and perception shape conflict. For this episode, we're putting the spotlight on Sudan. The war in Sudan, arguably the largest war most people haven't heard of. Its impact has been devastating. And while the two main fighting actors, the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces, might be familiar to some of our listeners, we need to approach this conflict not in isolation, but to view it as a proxy war involving regional powers and involving real geostrategic stakes. What happens in Sudan will have ramifications far beyond its borders. So today we'll unpack that and we'll ask, why doesn't this war get the attention it should? Is it just simply a lack of media access, or is it more political? And does anyone benefit from the silence? And who are the winners and the losers of this conflict? Not least the Sudanese people facing a severe humanitarian crisis, but also the regional powers involved. And it's my great privilege to introduce our guest for today's conversation, Cameron Hudson. Cameron is an expert on Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, conflict and humanitarian crises, as well as terrorism and irregular warfare. A former intelligence analyst at the CIA, and later on Director for Africa Affairs for the National Security Council, and Chief of Staff to the US Special Envoy for Sudan. He later led the Holocaust Museum's Genocide Prevention Center, was a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and is now a senior associate with CSIS's African program, and he's a regular media voice and recently testified before Congress on this exact topic. So, Cameron, welcome to Spotlight Africa podcast.
Thanks very much for having me.
It's great for you to be here with us. So I think before we dive into Sudan, maybe you could just reflect a little bit for our listeners on your very extensive career, and maybe just tell us a little bit how it has shaped your perception of contemporary geopolitics and especially conflict.
Well, I've been at this about 25 years now, and so I think what I've reflected on most recently is how the international response to conflicts like the one that we see in Sudan today, but not limited to Sudan, how the international response has changed over time. I was commenting to someone recently that 25 years ago, there were these broad coalitions of outside states that would come together to support very elaborate peace processes. Right. We had in Sudan, for example, we had the Troika, which was the UK, the US, and Norway, but we were supported in that effort through the African Union and through the regional organization IGAD in East Africa. And the efforts to bring about an end to the North-South Civil War, for example, were 5 years in the making. A 5-year sustained international effort coordinated through multiple international organizations, work of the UN Security Council. A really Herculean effort. And you saw a similar kind of effort responding to the genocide in Darfur just a few years later. And we're not seeing that today in Sudan or many other crises, certainly not in Africa, right? I think we're seeing, these very kind of ad hoc coalitions. We're seeing coalitions of states coming together like we're seeing with the Quad now in Sudan, of the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, all of whom have taken a stake and are contributing to the conflict in Sudan, and yet they are also mediating an end to the conflict in Sudan. So again, it's a very different, peacemaking process where you have people contributing to the conflict who are then also seen as the peacemakers, whereas before, you didn't have that, and you had international institutions which were leading the way. Clearly, you're not seeing those same institutions playing much of a role in places like Sudan or Eastern DRC or other conflict areas in Africa. So we are seeing a kind of fundamental, I think, reversal in how peacemaking has been made and is being made. And certainly I've been witness to that over the course of my career.
Yeah, you definitely noticed that. I mean, we'll get into the regional players a little bit later, touch on the UAE, but for an actor that's involved, but also part of that Quad kind of consortium, it does seem a little bit out of place, and you definitely see much less of a role for institutions like the African Union and particularly the UN. So yeah, and from your experience, because you've been involved in Africa in general, but particularly in Sudan, what makes it different? What's your experience been like? Working at the roles and the positions you've had. It's clearly and obviously a very geographically large country, especially before South Sudan broke away, and there's different religious and cultural demographics. But yeah, what's your experience been like throughout Africa, and maybe just zooming into Sudan?
Well, my interest in Sudan has stemmed from, I think, it's really unique geography and history. This idea that you have this country that is so clearly divided between Arab and African histories and identities, which is at the heart of many of the conflicts that the country has faced throughout its history since independence in the 1950s. So that's been, I think, the draw for me is understanding this interplay of cultures and religions and histories within this country. It's not unique to Sudan. There are many other parts of the continent, and frankly, where I have spent, I think, most of my professional career, whether it started out in West Africa, actually, before it moved to East Africa, but it's always been related to conflict. And I think it's those pressure points between these histories and cultures and identities, whether it's in the northern part of Ghana, Togo, Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, where you have the change from Christianity to Muslim, where you have the change in topography and climate and history and in all of these different factors that come together in these countries and create the tensions that have been there for many years. But the fact is that they haven't been fully addressed by the countries themselves. They haven't been, fully addressed by the multitude of outside interventions that have happened over the course of certainly since the end of the Cold War. And so that's, I think, the thing that has fascinated me about so many of the African cases that I've worked on is this collision of culture and language and religion and history in these countries. And frankly, I think at the end of the day, when I was in the U.S. government and I was responding to these things, I was very much of the view that it was the responsibility of the international community and actors like the United Nations or the United States or former colonial powers to kind of fix the problems that were inherent in many of these countries. And now that I am no longer in the U.S. government, I'm on the outside, and I spend more time actually talking um, to the average citizens of these countries. My own perspective has shifted in many ways, in that it's really incumbent upon the populations of these places themselves and their leadership and their ability to choose their leaders that it's going to resolve these problems. The United States and the international community is not going to fix what ails Sudan, for example. We're not going to fix the tribal differences and the regional differences and the historical differences that exist within that country. We can support it. We can help enable it and create conditions where those issues might get addressed. But ultimately, it's going to take the people themselves and their leaders themselves, fixing the many problems that they encounter right now. And so, yeah, so I think that I have a very different perspective on the outside than I did when I was, inside the government.
And it almost seems, in this era of, I don't know if return to is the best way to phrase it, of kind of power politics, where, maybe decade or two ago, as you talk, the international community playing a really key role. You might have these underlining issues, as you said, be it historical, colonial, religious, cultural, but there are just some places where you have these pressure points, these geostrategic pressure points. I mean, we can talk about the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea, but it almost comes across as there might have been these underlining social, political, historical tensions, but the port of Sudan is based where the port of Sudan is, and it just so happens that that's a pressure point, and that's where a lot of these things kind of get amplified a lot.
For sure, and I think we've seen these geostrategic pressure points. They've changed over time. Again, 20 years ago, the Red Sea was not the same, geostrategic, importance. It didn't have that same importance that it has today. And you've seen that driven in large part, I think, by the fact that the states that border the Red Sea are much more powerful, much more influential than they were a decade ago. Again, speaking about Sudan, as I said before, 20 years ago when we were resolving conflict in Sudan, it was the U.S. and a handful of European powers that were really the driving forces behind that. And today, the power lies in the Gulf states. It lies in Turkey and Qatar and Saudi Arabia and UAE. They are the difference makers in a conflict like Sudan, whereas 20 years ago they weren't even at the table as part of a discussion about how the conflicts in Sudan might get resolved. And so we have seen, the importance of that region as it has developed its own wealth, its own stability, its own new generation of governance in those Gulf states. We have seen its importance grow, its influence certainly in the Horn of Africa grow, and their own ambitions. I mean, I think it's fair to say that UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, they all have much greater ambitions for themselves, politically, economically, security wise, in the Horn of Africa. And so that ambition, I think, is also running up against what we are seeing in the United States and in Europe, which is a kind of stepping back from the traditional role that they have played in supporting the political and economic development of African states. As that step back occurs, a vacuum gets created, and opportunities get created for these new, more wealthy and ambitious states to step in and play a role in shaping the conflicts in a way that will ultimately benefit their strategic interests in the Horn of Africa region. So it's a fascinating time. It's a dynamic time, and we are seeing a real change in the geopolitics of the region and the world.
And maybe we can zoom in a little bit for our listeners, and maybe bring them up to speed a little bit, because you mentioned that 20 years ago, and maybe for some of our listeners who don't follow what's been going on in Sudan all that clearly, they see maybe quite a few ceasefires and different kind of milestones. So let's maybe zoom in a little bit, and maybe you can bring us up to speed. I don't know if you want to start maybe around 2019 or even go a little bit before then, but how did we end up here? Are you able to give us a bit of a summary and bring us up to speed with everything?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think 2019 is a good place to start because it was ultimately the demise of the Bashir regime. President
Mm.
Bashir, came to power through a coup in 1989, overthrowing a democratic government in the country, and imposing his version of political Islam on Sudan, which made Sudan a terrorist state in the eyes of the United States, but I think it's fair to say a source of regional instability and domestic instability. So he carried out brutal civil war in the country against the southern population. He then carried out a kind of a campaign of ethnic cleansing and genocide in Darfur, and you know in addition to that, a kind of host of human rights abuses and abuses of civil rights in the country. And so the the popular revolution that emerged in late 2018, that he had worked very hard to try to prevent from happening, I think took root because of what was fundamentally an economic crisis in the country that stemmed from the loss of South Sudan and the loss of oil revenue when South Sudan became an independent country in 2011. It finally caught up with the Bashir government
Yeah.
in 2018, putting people in the streets around a kind of shared purpose and a shared understanding, right? I mean, again, the dividing lines within Sudan have always been there, and President Bashir was
Mm.
was very good at playing communities off of each other so that there was never a unified front to his rule. And that all, I think, eroded with the economic crisis that the country faced in 2018. It was sustained into 2019. And what I like to remind people of is that the Bashir regime was not fully ended with the revolution in 2019. Protesters camped out for months, weeks and months, in front of the army headquarters, the most powerful institution in the country that was there protecting President Bashir. I think that the army themselves feared that they could be overthrown and that their power structure within the country and their economic hold over the levers of economic wealth in the country could be overthrown. And
And
so
by army, you mean the SAF?
Yes, the Sudan Armed
Yeah.
Forces. Yeah, and
Mm.
so, but not just the Sudan Armed Forces, the entire security apparatus of the country,
Mm. There
controlled.
was an attempt to integrate, the two. Am I right in saying that there was an attempt to integrate the RSF and the SAF?
Well, there was in the kind of early 2010s.
Right.
There was an effort to normalize the RSF. The RSF was the predecessor to the or the precursor successor to the Janjaweed militia that the government used to carry out its crimes in Darfur. Um, but when they finally got rid of President Bashir, the army stayed in power. The army got rid of Bashir as a means of offering a kind of sacrifice to the people, but they ended up holding on to power. They negotiated a power sharing transitional government with the international community. That brought in a civilian leader as prime minister who lasted in the job for just over 2 years until the SAF and the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces militia, um, overthrew that civilian government, largely because civilian leaders were, I think, getting too close to trying to dismantle that regime that they were holding on to, and so shedding light on the various industries and corporations that the military controlled and profited from, and upsetting this regime that they benefited from. So as the civilians got too close to unseating the military and their control over the levers of power, that's when the civilians were kicked out, and that was in 2021. And it didn't take long before, by not having a civilian force in power, there was no force kind of between the RSF and the SAF. And so it's sort of, I describe it to people as sort of like, bone on bone. When there's no cartilage between those bones, um, it causes a lot of pain, and the civilians were essentially that cartilage that allowed these security forces to exist or to coexist within the country. But when those civilians were removed, you really had these two, very powerful, imposing forces rubbing up against each other in ways that were not solvable, and so it led to this civil war that the country finds itself in, for the last, almost 3 years now.
And also, for some of our listeners, I think traditionally the South being more kind of ethnically African and Christian, and the north being more kind of Arab and Muslim. And I think when that kind of paints a picture, if you can view the map of where we are today, there seems to be still some legacy in terms of the territory that is held. And you've got kind of Khartoum and Darfur. I think that's brought us up to speed. Can you tell us a little bit about now what's happening now, especially in terms of what's the current situation like? Who's holding what?
Well, I mean, I think the current situation is certainly for Sudanese civilians is fairly dire. We are, I think, about 30 months in, 2.5 years to this war between the RSF and the SAF. We have seen at the beginning of the war, the RSF in almost a kind of blitzkrieg-like fashion, take over portions of the Nile River Valley, the most productive, farmland, but also the population centers of the country. Let's not forget the war broke out in the capital, Khartoum, a city of 10 million people. And so from the very start of the conflict, you had high rates of civilian casualties, high levels of civilian displacement from their homes, a kind of internally displaced crisis in the country. There are 13 or 14 million people displaced right now. There has been a war by the RSF on the productive aspects of the economy. So we have seen factories destroyed, we've seen farmland destroyed. Destruction of livelihoods has created a humanitarian crisis and a displacement crisis in the country that is, the worst in the world today. So in addition to 14 million people, displaced, you've got another 3 million externally displaced. You have more than half the country, more than 25 million people in desperate need of humanitarian assistance daily. And you have an increasing famine warning that is spreading across the country. You have seen the collapse of markets. You have seen the collapse of food stores and the destruction of those food stocks. And then you have seen by both the RSF and the SAF the use of denial of humanitarian assistance, so the prevention of international humanitarian aid from reaching those in need, such that you have famine conditions in many parts of the country now, and reports daily of famine deaths and increasingly spreading disease as well in urban areas, but also in these displaced people's camps. So it is, it is as bad as it gets across the country. But especially, I think there are a couple of areas that stand out right now. Al Fasher, the capital of North Darfur, being, I think, the place where we see the most vicious struggle for survival happening right now. As I said before, there was a kind of a back and forth over the course of 2 years' time, where cities were captured by the RSF, retaken by the army. You've seen cities and regions change hands multiple times through the course of the war. But in the last sort of 6 or 8 months, we have seen a kind of a stasis, where there are fewer cities that are being contested and fewer regions being contested. The army in the spring drove the RSF out of Khartoum. They have retaken control of the Nile River Valley, and kind of the productive areas of the country. And so where we see the fighting now is largely limited to the Kordofan region of the country, which is right in the center, and then, of course, the region in North Darfur, which abuts the Kordofans. The RSF largely now controls all of Darfur except for the capital of North Darfur, El Fasher. As a result, it also controls the Sudan's borders with Libya, Chad, Central African Republic, and parts of South Sudan. So it's able to supply itself across border. And then the army controls, what is the rest of the country, and it's this smaller portion in the center of the country that is still being contested.
And there's kind of an area I really want to pick your brain on. When you look into this conflict, you see these kind of traditional aspects. You mentioned with South Sudan, the separatist war, oil played quite a key part. Gold seems to be playing quite a key part, with the RSF in this current conflict. You've then got your kind of key physical pressure points, like you said, the Nile Valley, the Port of Sudan. So you almost have this traditional kind of natural resources and strategic points. But I want to talk about that, but also, but then at the same time, drones now being kind of introduced into the conflict and targeting some of those, oil depots and some of the critical infrastructure. And we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the information, media vacuum. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that, just in terms of the kind of elements of this conflict, the role of natural resources and kind of drones and drone technology, and maybe we'll segue into some of the more regional powers and dynamics from here.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's clear that this conflict has to be financed in some way, and the most readily available way to do that is through the country's gold exports. Sudan, before the conflict, was just emerging as a significant gold exporter, mostly mines in the east and in the north of the country. What we know from new reporting, though, is that the RSF has been rapidly expanding gold production in areas under their control, specifically in Darfur. And so I think it's a good rule of thumb that both sides are earning probably around $2 billion a year each in illicit gold exports. Ironically, all of that gold is going to the same place. It's going to the United Arab Emirates, but they both have a substantial reservoir of cash earnings that they are able to use to finance the war effort. And so what we have seen, in the course of this war, it's interesting actually when you think back, or when I think back to the images uh, of the fighting that was going on at the start of the war. It looked very much like a kind of traditional old school African conflict. It was a lot of urban warfare. It was a lot of use of technical vehicles. So like, old Toyota Hiluxes with a 50 caliber machine gun attached to the back. It looked kind of ragtag, in the way it was being fought, and not unlike we have seen in other African contexts or in, Somalia, and other places. So very much a kind of 20th century war, if you will. And
Mm,
I would say that in the last year, with the significant gold earnings that both sides have earned and the significant interest in the conflict from regional states, very wealthy regional states, you are seeing a modernization of warfare in Sudan. So you're seeing, you know, next generation armored personnel carriers, as you said, drones. We're seeing anti-missile and anti-drone defense systems being deployed. And these aren't just sort of, kind of secondhand gray market, black market, equipment. This is the latest generation high-tech weaponry from China, from Iran, from Turkey, that is being deployed into this battlefield. And so and drones are very much a part of that. Both sides have been able to equip themselves with both kind of short range tactical drones and long range what they call strategic drones, which means that in the first year or two of the war you would be able to kind of see where the battle lines were, and you could track their movement, and that actually gave some predictability to how this war was going. And you could see, the RSF taking city after city after city along the map,
mm,
and the RS and the army reclaiming city after city after city, and you could see the movement of battle lines across the country in kind of predictable ways because they traveled along the main roads and the strategic nodes in the country. But with the introduction of so many armed drones, you're seeing that any city on any day can be the subject of an attack. And
right.
both sides have shown that they are willing to use these drones, at will. We have seen, for example, the RSF attacking Khartoum. They've attacked Port Sudan. This is 1,000 miles away from where these drones are being piloted from, and they are able to strike, quite a far distance from where they're based, which means that the entire country becomes vulnerable, at any given moment to
Mm.
having the war, come to their city, and that makes for a lack of predictability in this fighting. It makes it very difficult to protect civilian populations, especially with the RSF. You have a group of people who are willing to use drones against civilian populations at will. So we have seen just in the last few weeks explicit targeting of mosques, of hospitals, of displacement centers, places where civilians are sheltering or seeking support and assistance. They have been intentionally targeted by RSF drones. And so when you have that, it means that no one is safe, and no one is safe anywhere in the country. And that is, I think, a new wrinkle that makes this much more difficult to resolve.
Yeah, that's actually pretty much exact. I was just going to ask, is one side getting the upper hand from this? It seems like from the RSF point of view, if your funding is flowing, if you've got access to drones, you really just have to make it a tough time for the authorities, destabilize, disrupt their sources of revenue, through essentially just destabilize and just disrupt. Would you say that one side is kind of benefiting from this kind of new style, new tactical, kind of warfare, or do you think it's both sides?
Well, I would say that both sides they're benefiting from it, although in perhaps slightly different ways. But if you look at the RSF, just this week we're talking, mid-October, they targeted Khartoum with a drone attack overnight, and this, you've got the government trying to say that people are welcome to return to Khartoum. We want people to rebuild their lives. They're putting pressure on the business community to start up factories. They are trying to begin the reconstruction of Khartoum. Periodically, we see pictures of the Khartoum International Airport that is being rebuilt. They expect it to reopen in a matter of weeks, they're saying. But how can you expect that airport to reopen, and how can you expect people to return home if on any given day the capital can be hit in a drone attack, right?
Right.
It makes everything completely vulnerable. And so for the RSF, they're able to undermine the government's ability to reassure the citizens of the country that reconstruction is happening and that it's safe to return home, because they can't really make that promise anymore if the RSF is willing and able to use drones to target the capital and the civilian population. So that's a huge benefit to the RSF. I think the army has benefited as well, because the army was struggling at the beginning of this war, to maintain territory. We saw the RSF take huge amounts of territory from the army. That's largely because the RSF is a much more agile, mobile fighting
Mm.
force.
More guerrilla, kind of less.
Yeah, more of a
Yeah.
counterinsurgency force, owing to their roots as the Janjaweed, right? Which they were on horseback or they were in trucks. And so that was their value added, right? They brought a tactical agility that the army has never had. The army has always been a very, kind of conventional army with tanks and, capable of defending fixed positions, but not as a kind of expeditionary force. And so their acquisition of armed drones has given them the agility and the mobility in the air that they lacked on the ground. And that has helped them even the kind of tactical and operational playing field against the RSF. So drones have benefited the army as well, because it gives them an even playing field against the RSF, which they didn't have when this was a kind of more conventional fight happening on the ground.
I mean, I think this is exactly why there needs to be more of the spotlight, on this conflict, because just maybe from your average day listener, they probably do perceive, insurgents on horseback, maybe, but it's so much more complex than that. I know that horses mean a great deal for the Sudanese people. There's a lot of pride in their horses, but it's just so much more kind of it's modern at the same time as maybe being 20th century. It's both, but it clearly sounds like this is not just two armed groups fighting each other, the SAF and the RSF, but there are many players involved. I mean, there's been reports of the Wagner Group being involved in Sudan and being involved in some of the gold mining. I don't know if that's something that you've looked into.
Well, it is. I mean, I think that the maybe the kind of the big picture argument that I would make is that in these contexts of war, there are going to be countries and states and entities that see a benefit, right? And so there are countries that, that are looking at Sudan as a way to enhance their own kind of geopolitical prowess. There are countries that and entities that see a commercial opportunity to go in and to exploit either an illicit operation or to get in on the ground floor to of some new investment opportunity. So there are always companies and individuals and countries that see opportunity in the chaos. And I think that is, that's no different in Sudan today, right? Where obviously I think it all starts with the geography, as we've talked about already. The Red Sea has become a more important, you know, um, political node and geostrategic node, with the Straits of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait just off of the coast, with, Iranian involvement, in the region now. You're seeing countries like Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE projecting more of their influence into the region. Everyone wants to see an agreeable government take shape in Sudan, a government that will be an ally to their country, who might give them port access, who might give them access to the reconstruction that's going to happen, that's going to give them access to the mining that seems quite plentiful in Sudan right now. So I think that you're seeing a real regional competition take place among actors who are competing not just in Sudan, but they're competing in Libya, they're competing in Yemen, they're competing in Gaza. They're competing all across the region, and Sudan is just another theater in which these countries are competing to build their influence and to build their advantage over their rivals.
So there's a lot happening. There's a lot of people involved. But so why so little media attention? Do you think? Why? Look, we all know. Ukraine, Gaza, and is it a case of war fatigue? Is it a case of there's clearly a lot of political implications for what goes on in Russia and Ukraine, and there's a lot of audience strong emotions and feeling with what goes on with Israel, Palestine, and Gaza. But it just seems a little bit suspicious. Like, do you think it's as simple as there's just maybe attention is elsewhere, media find it difficult to operate in this area, or do you think it's being suppressed maybe for some alternative reason?
Listen, I think the answer is it could be all of the above, right? It's not
Right.
just one. It's not just one thing that is conspiring against this conflict. I think it is true that international attention has been focused on, what is considered higher priority conflicts. So whether that's Gaza or Ukraine, I think that's absolutely, played a role. I think that the fact that we haven't been able to get a lot of media access to Sudan, right? And to the conflict areas. It's happening largely in remote areas where there isn't, media there to cover. We get, kind of clips on social media and things, but I think certainly for Western audiences, when we don't see on the front page of our newspapers the images and see the stories of what's happening, it does make it harder to get people to pay attention or to put pressure on their elected leaders to play more of a role. Um, but I also think that there is some, I think there is some kind of nihilism that exists today that, didn't exist 20 years ago. 20 years ago, we collectively, at least in the West or the international community, thought that we could solve Sudan's problems, thought we could end the war in, the North-South Civil War, thought we um, could end the conflict in Darfur, and not just. It wasn't just the hubris of thinking that we could do it. It was this idea that we were responsible, that we had a responsibility to protect people, that we had a responsibility to end these conflicts. And that was a responsibility shared by the United Nations and other powerful states. And I think that that sentiment is no longer there. I think that we no longer view it as our collective responsibility to end these conflicts. And I think that maybe even we think today that we're not going to end it. That Sudan has been in conflict in one form or another for decades, and that we certainly in the United States have other interests at home, primarily that is going to prevent us from playing the kind of role and dedicating the kind of resources that we might have done a generation ago. So I think all of these things are playing a role in making it very difficult to get attention focused on what's happening in Sudan, and to get more resources dedicated to what's happening. I think the other last thing is it's really complicated, right? We've been talking about this. It's a really complicated story. There's no easy way to tell it. There's no guy with a white hat and guy with a black hat. There's no good guy and bad guy. It's a conflict full of bad guys doing bad things, supported by bad actors. And so, because it lacks a clear and simple narrative, I think it makes the telling of that narrative even more difficult to, just average audiences.
Yeah, and I think that that power of narrative is just increasingly becoming more important when we look at the theater of any conflict. How it's perceived through the media. We watch broadcast, we listen to podcasts, we read the news, and perception is almost as important, if not more important, than kinetic kind of events on the ground. And I want to kind of that we were speaking more from like an observer point of view there, like the media kind of attention on the conflict. I want to also just zoom in a little bit. How do you think the RSF, the SAF mobilize support, recruit, try to frame their own legitimacy? Because I'm interested in how information flows in like grassroots kind of level. You know, it may be that a lot of people are illiterate. Like you can't write pamphlets. People might only have radio, probably more kind of cell phone connection now, but you can't just assume that, right, there's going to be a TV broadcast, and so I'm interested, do you think propaganda is a role in on the local kind of level?
Well, yeah, I mean it does for sure, but as you suggest, the 50 million Sudanese or the 35 million who are still left in the country, they don't have reliable access to social
Mm.
media, those kinds of things. They do get a lot of media passed around through, WhatsApp groups, voice memos, and things like that, that get spread around. Radio is still utilized, and there's no question that there is um, a propaganda war that is going on. I think that the subject of the propaganda war is more the international community. I think,
Right.
or even the diaspora community. I think that there's a real effort by both sides in this conflict to shape a narrative, to help enhance their own legitimacy and credibility, not just in the eyes of the people of Sudan, but I think more so in the eyes of the international community. right?
I think that's a really interesting point. Yeah.
Yeah.
And before we kind of wrap up, this conflict's ramifications and impact will go far past its borders. There's an immigration crisis element to this. Is there anything that we haven't touched that you'd like to just kind of cover?
Well, I think that from for me, one thing I've been thinking about just recently is this idea of accountability. The crimes that have been committed in this conflict against civilians. I mean, it really is, as much as we talk about it's a war about between the SAF and the RSF, it's really a war against civilians in the country. They make up far more of the casualties than any combatant on any side. They have been targeted throughout with, I think, really some of the worst crimes against humanity that we have seen. And just last week there was this conviction of by the ICC of a Janjaweed leader from the genocide in Darfur 20 years ago. And I've been hung up about this because that was a trial that took a decade. It's one guy. And there's all of this kind of self-congratulatory messaging around, well, justice has been served in Darfur from what happened 20 years ago. And and I think one of the reasons why we are in the position that we are in today in Sudan is because there's never been any justice for the crimes that have been committed. And there's absolutely no discussion going on today around what justice for the crimes being committed in this context look like. And I think the international community has really failed. The problem is that the international community thinks with this one conviction that it has succeeded, and that this conviction is going to serve as a deterrent against future crimes, when in fact those crimes are happening every single day in Darfur and across Sudan right now. And so I just think that we have lost focus on what justice processes can and should look like. There's no effort to document in a systematic way the crimes that are being committed. All of the crimes are being reported in kind of anecdotal ways right now. And I just think that I fear for the future of Sudan, even when this war ends, of how this culture and how this society is going to heal itself after the crimes that have been committed today. And I fear for the unity of this country and what that means for the geopolitics of the region, because I don't imagine that we are going to have a kind of, we might have an end of the fighting, but the idea of a permanent peace feels very far away to me right now.
It does indeed, and we'll have to just keep on following the situation, and maybe we can reconnect in 3 months or 6 months. But I think we'll close it on that note. And Cameron, thank you so much for your time, for your insights. It's been an absolute honor to have you on our podcast. And for our listeners, I'm the host, Struan, and thanks for listening to Spotlight Africa.